Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Khalil Cumberbatch is the Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society and an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work. So it might come as a surprise to learn that he has served time in prison or that he was nearly deported 4 years ago. He was completing his master's degree in social work here in New York City in 2014 when one morning, just a week from finishing his degree, he got a knock on the door as he was preparing his daughters for school and getting ready for the day. It was Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Khalil Cumberbatch joins us now to discuss his story and what it reveals about the U.S. criminal justice system and our current immigration policies. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Leonard. And it's always great to be back on WBAI with the amazing listeners. So thank you.
Last week, Joel Arona Lara was driving his wife to a scheduled cesarean section when he was detained at a gas station in California by ICE officers. Have you heard of other cases like that?
Yes, unfortunately. And so it is unfortunate in this case. I mean, literally someone who is bringing his pregnant wife to the hospital to deliver. And yeah, we're hearing more and more of these cases. The most recent and local one to the listeners here is the person who was a pizza delivery man, just quite literally just doing his job, delivering a pizza, going to a military base, and he was questioned and then ultimately detained. It was only through a huge advocacy effort on his behalf that I would say, and the national attention that case drew, that put some pressure on the government to actually ultimately release him.
Well, neither of them had any trouble with the law. Mr. Arona Lara's only mistake, according to ICE at the time, was illegally residing in the United States. Well, based on your experience, do you know why they would choose to arrest him then when he was taking his partner to the hospital to have their baby?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately there is no rhyme or reason for the current immigration policies under the current administration. I will say, though, that we are seeing more and more, and I say we meaning the advocates, are seeing more and more the trend that this current administration has a very keen focus on people who are here undocumented. So whether you have had criminal justice involvement or not, you're still a priority for ICE and for the current administration to detain and ultimately deport you.
Well, ICE must have felt a certain embarrassment because then they later said that Mr. Arona Lara was wanted on a homicide warrant in Mexico, something not in the original statement. How common is it for ICE to change its account after an arrest?
I mean, I don't have a statistic, but I will say this. I mean, I would actually say that ICE probably feels very little embarrassment. I mean, they probably, they are a well-oiled, very calculated machine who has a mission, and their mission is to do things just like that, to grab people at any point where they can find them, whether that's at a court hearing or in a gas station or delivering a pizza, that they are executing what their mission is. And so they feel probably very little remorse as an organization to reach the goal of detaining people, deporting them who are here undocumented with or without criminal justice involvement.
And his lawyer says that he was unable to find that warrant from Mexico.
I would love to see the warrant, right? I mean, I think we are in a time where people can make baseless claims and just quite honestly not be held accountable to prove anything.
Didn't Governor Cuomo pardon Harvey Gomez just the other day?
The governor did.
Are you familiar with that case?
I'm familiar with the fact that he pardoned it and what was reported in the press release that the day that he actually had one of his court proceedings, the governor granted him a pardon. And so, I, as someone who has received a pardon, someone who works on behalf of an organization who is pushing the governor to use more pardons, applaud the governor, applaud his counsel, Alfonso David, applaud people like Rosanna Rosado, Secretary of State, for making sure that immigrants are protected, immigrant New Yorkers are protected. And so we applaud the governor and push him to use more pardons in this particular case. Harvey Gomez was someone who benefited the day of his court, but there are many people who have actually already been deported, who are already in their home countries facing, very atrocious conditions, and are away from their family. And so we would push the governor to use his pardon power more to actually bring people back to the U.S., but also obviously continue to keep them from being deported.
Harvey Gomez had been convicted for the sale of a controlled substance a decade ago. Are there any parallels with your experience?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, when the governor granted me a pardon, I had been convicted of a criminal conviction. In my case, my charge was a violent offense. I had a robbery in the first degree. And so the governor obviously...
Which you had committed.
Which I did commit, yeah. And I've said that, on public records. I've said that in interviews. I'm someone who readily admits to the fact that I did commit the crime that I was ultimately convicted of. And so, yes, there is parallels in the sense that I was convicted of a charge. But in this case, I think that Harvey Gomez is someone who, unfortunately, is a product on the failed war on drugs. I mean, New York State right now is having very serious conversations about the legalization of marijuana. And I would argue and say people like Harvey Gomez, non-citizens who have suffered because of that failed war on drugs, that they are now facing other collateral consequences. And in this case, the governor used power that he has to sort of right some of the wrongs.
Now, he's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, is HIV positive. He might have been afraid of where he would have been deported to.
Yeah, I mean, so he's of Haitian descent, and unfortunately, people who identify as openly gay and openly HIV positive are not always welcomed in certain parts of Haiti, as it is the same in certain parts of this country and in other countries around the world. But I would also say that even if he felt comfortable returning home, the fact that someone has lived in a country for, in many respects, decades, has assimilated into a country, considers it to be home, should be enough reason to consider for us to grant a pardon. In this case, obviously, yes, we want to protect people like Harvey Gomez from any further persecution once we deport them to their home country. But of course, there are many, many other cases where there are people who are just as deserving, who has family here, who have community ties here, who have contributed positively to society, and we should keep them here based on that.
When were you detained by ICE? Detained, not arrested. Is there a difference?
So, yeah, there is a difference. I mean, I was arrested and detained by ICE. May 8th, 2014 was the day that ICE came to my home, arrested me, and arrested meaning that they put handcuffs on me, had put handcuffs on me in front of my children, in front of my wife, in front of my neighbors. My daughter at that time was attending a school that was right around the corner from my home. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, all of the teachers are parking, all of their classmates are getting out of cars and walking, school buses and so on and so forth. And they brought me out and paraded me in front of all of my neighbors and all of those other people that I mentioned, and put me into one of 4 unmarked vehicles. I can only imagine that the perception that was given to my neighbors and my daughter's classmates and teachers was that it was a modern-day Pablo Escobar living in our neighborhood. I mean, 4 unmarked vehicles with 6 agents. I mean, you can imagine the perception.
Well, you'd been released from prison. You'd served how many years?
I served a total of 6.5 years in the New York State prison system.
For the robbery?
For robbery in the first degree, yep.
And you were released in 2010. Why didn't ICE detain you upon your conviction in 2003? If a conviction alone is grounds for removal, why not then? Or when you were released in 2010? Yeah.
I think that, again, there's really no rhyme or reason to how ICE operates. The other thing to keep in mind is that they have a considerably large backlog. The other thing to keep in mind is that I was arrested and detained underneath the Obama administration, and I think that it is, there are many valid reasons to critique the current administration and their immigration policies and how they are wielding the machine that he inherited. But let's not be mistaken. That machine was ramped up. It was well oiled. It was well resourced way before the current president got into office. And let's not also forget that the Obama administration left deporting more people than all of the previous administrations combined.
Some people dubbed him the deporter in chief. And President Trump and some of the people in his administration just claim, well, we're just doing things that were already instituted by the Obama administration. Is that true, or have they ramped it up?
Yeah, I think that they have a different focus. I think the current administration's focus is largely on people who are undocumented. And so whether that is people with or without criminal justice involvement, the Obama administration had a very keen focus on people with criminal convictions. And so whether you were documented or not, if you had a criminal conviction, you were at the top tier of what their priority structure were.
According to government statistics, about 58% of ICE removals, they call the people they deport removals, have been convicted of a crime. Do enforcement agents take your conduct in prison or after release, parole, whatever, into account when they're making these decisions?
So if you have certain type of criminal convictions, or even in some cases criminal charges, which doesn't even mean that you had to have been found guilty by a criminal court. You could just be charged with a certain offense. In terms of immigration policy and law, there is a list of convictions and charges that a person can face or have been convicted of that makes them mandatorily detainable and almost inevitably deportable. You almost lose all of the reliefs that you would have in a regular immigration proceedings. And that category is called aggravated felonies. And so now the irony of it is that the offense that a person is charged or convicted of doesn't actually have to be aggravated, and it doesn't have to actually be a felony. And so while ICE may say that 58% of the people that they remove are convicted of a criminal offense, that doesn't mean that they're all violent offenses, right? That means that there are people who may have been convicted of quite literally misdemeanor convictions that the court says is not warranted any jail time, that they may be assigned to probation or the case may be dismissed. But in some cases, even if they're charged, they are eligible for mandatory detention and removal.
I'm assuming that applies to some people who are arrested for possession of marijuana, which they would not be arrested for today.
Mm-hmm. It does, unfortunately. And I mean, even more devious than that is if your crime involves what immigration policy dictates as a crime of moral turpitude, which is a very broad definition, basically meaning that if you had any devious act or devious intention in your act, that you could be almost inevitably detained.
What's a devious act?
Meaning, like, if you jump the turnstile, like fare evasion, right? Like, one would argue and say, like, you know, like that has some level of deviousness in it. I would argue and say that that is a product of a person's economic social status. But there are people who may say if you do two or more of those, right? So you could have a fare evasion, turnstile jumping, you could have a shoplifting charge, and you could automatically be determined to be inevitably detainable and almost mandatorily deportable. And so it doesn't have to even be offenses as most people would assume are violent offenses. In my case, yes, it was a violent offense, but in most cases, they're not.
Well, the assumption is that the recidivism is likely to occur, but you're with the Fortune Society, which is based on the concept that people deserve a second chance.
And a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and in some cases a first, right? I mean, there are many cases we can point to that say someone was never really dealt a fair hand from the very beginning. And so Fortune Society is a 50-year-old organization that was founded by David Rothenberg, and it was found in advocacy. It was largely to educate the public about the people that we're really talking about. Now, this was in the 60s, and so as you can imagine, you know, now with the term mass incarceration, when you talk about criminal justice reform, it's not a term or an idea that is foreign to many. In the 60s and the 70s, that was something that was almost unheard of, to have people themselves who were formerly incarcerated actually advocating on their own behalf. And so now Fortune has since morphed into a 50-year-old organization. We service about 7,000 people annually, which is a huge lift on our behalf, but it really is a small drop in the bucket of the amount of people leaving jails and prisons and the amount of help that they actually need to help them get back on the track.
A number of other groups are also concerned about this. Human Rights Watch, for example, has been pushing for the release of lifers after they reach a certain age because there's a strong unlikelihood, is that such a word? But it's strongly unlikely that they would commit a crime when they're in their 60s or 70s after they spent a long time in prison.
Yeah, I mean, the eligibility for parole based on age and time served is something that Fortune cares about, something that Fortune is advocating on behalf of the people who fit that criteria. You know, we actually house people temporarily when they're leaving state prisons. In some respect, after 3 or 4 decades of serving time in prison. And as you can imagine, the world was different 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And for someone who served 30, 40 years in prison, returning back to a city like New York with everything as fast-paced as it is extremely, extremely debilitating in many respects. And so Fortune actually houses some of those people that our current president and CEO, Joanne Page, commonly refers to as members of the Deuce Club, people who have served their minimum amount of time. So 25 to life, you've served 25 years, you go in front of the parole board, and the parole board continually denies you with the maximum amount of time that they can, which is 2 years. We have people that we serve at Fortune, who work at Fortune, who have went to 8, 9, 10 parole boards, hit 2 years at every parole board. If you go 8 times, that's 16 years on top of your minimum.
And that's because the parole board still deems them as a possible threat?
I think that's the justification that the parole board would use. I think that, you know, the parole board operates based on a sense of fear. I think that they fear that certain people, based on certain original charges and convictions, would somehow be more likely to recidivate, when actually the data actually shows opposite of that. And so you mentioned one data point that we can look at, right? The older that a person gets is the less likely they are to make risky decisions. And if you add to that, while a person is incarcerated, education, the higher education a person has, the less likely they are to recidivate, the type of charge that they were given, the amount of time that they've served. If you take all of that in consideration, someone who is 55 years old, like you said, all likelihood, we can fairly say that that person will probably not recidivate.
You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm talking with Khalil Cumberbatch, who is now the Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society and also an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. Before they showed up at your door, did you have any reason to think that ICE might come for you?
Yeah.
Were you on the lookout?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I had a criminal conviction, the fact that I was not a naturalized citizen, although I was a legal permanent resident,
how old were you when you came here?
I was 4.
So your mother brought you here at 4 from where?
From Guyana, my birth country of Guyana. Came here as legal permanent residents, was in this country almost 20 years before I committed the crime that I was ultimately convicted of. And so, yes, I knew that the fact that I had a criminal conviction, the fact that I was not a naturalized citizen, put me at risk of one day having ICE show up at my door. But even still, with that, right, like there is really no preparation a person can make for being snatched away from their family and then being held, with no regard to any of the connections that you have to community. And so quite literally the day that they came to get me, not only was I 1 week away from a master's degree, but I was actually scheduled to go to class that night, right? And so one of my first questions to the immigration officers in my home was, how long is this going to take? Right? Because I have to go to class tonight, right? It was still a priority for me. And so, yes, I had some heads up, but you can't really adequately prepare for that.
Did you study psychology as part of your work toward that master's degree?
Yeah, psychology was a part of it, but my degree is in social work.
The reason I ask is I wonder if you have a sense of what your daughter's witnessing, what happened, might mean to them over the long term.
Yeah, so I do have a sense of what it means.
How old were they at the time?
My oldest daughter was probably 6, and my youngest daughter was around 2.5.
So the younger one probably didn't really understand
the ramifications.
ramifications.
She didn't really understand the context. My oldest daughter, it was a crash course introduction to what I call the gray in life, right? The shade of gray, right? As children, all too often, it's black and white. It's good and bad. And so here was a situation where at a very young age, she had to be introduced to the area of gray. And what I mean by that is, we at some point had to tell her that I was in jail, right? And here it is for her, her father, someone who she views as a good person, and jail are for quote unquote bad people. And so how do you rationalize that as a 6 or 7 year old, right? And so my oldest was exposed to that. And then my youngest, in her innocence, just, viewed my leaving as voluntary, in the same way that I voluntarily decided to leave, is I can just voluntarily decide to come back. And so one of the questions that she would consistently and constantly ask me every time we spoke was, when am I coming home? Mm-hmm. Right, Daddy, when are you going to come home? Right, because you chose to leave, and you can undoubtedly choose to come back. And so they had to struggle with that for the 5.5 months, on top of the experience that my wife had, right? I mean, my wife woke up that morning in a 2-parent household. By the end of the day, she was a single mother overnight, and she had to struggle and figure out what she was going to do with 2 children, when that morning she had a husband in the home who was willing to help and provide for the family. The other thing I would say is, to give you a sense of how my youngest is still struggling with this, recently, sometime in, I would say, March or April, I was honored by an organization called Immigrant Defense Project, who does amazing work around the intersection of immigration and criminal justice. They helped to advocate on my behalf while I was in immigration detention. And they gave me an award that night. My youngest and oldest daughter were there, including my wife. And as you can imagine, for someone who comes from the background that I come from, being formerly incarcerated and being held in immigration detention is extremely important for me, for my daughters, to always be exposed to the new person that I am, right? This is a way of recreating the legacy that I've been working so hard to recreate for them. And so getting an award, the whole night goes by, the whole hullabaloo that comes with getting an award. We're in the car on the way home. And of course, in my speech that night, I talked about being incarcerated, I talked about detention, I talked about why, exceptionalizing people is very dangerous in this work, and why it is important for for organizations like Immigrant Defense Project to continue to do the work. And so my youngest daughter heard that. And so on the ride home, she was sitting next to me, and my wife was in the passenger seat and I was in the back. And she looked at me and said, Daddy, you were in jail? And, here I've spoken about my prison and immigration detention experience so much that I just quite literally never gave it real thought, that she couldn't really contextualize that. And here she is asking me, like, you were in jail? And the look on her face was one of, like, astonishment. And so I said, yes, baby, Daddy was in jail. I made a bad decision. And,
How old were you at the time?
When you
made the bad decision?
At the time I committed my crime, I was 20 years old. Mm-hmm. 20 years old, a couple of weeks away from my 21st birthday. And why did you commit the robbery? Well, I mean, for a slew of reasons. One was that I was making unhealthy decisions that led up to that point, including, starting to carry a gun. The value of the perception of my friends meant more than me than righting wrong. And so, I committed acts that I knew were illegal and wrong, but yet and still, my friendships with those people were more important to me at the time. And really, quite honestly, didn't have any real consideration for the people who really cared about me, for my family, who, what would happen to me. What would happen to them if I wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so having all of that experience, and then answering this, this 7-year-old, and admitting to her that, yes, I was in jail, and the look that she gave me was one of complete astonishment. And I would also say a level of shock and surprise. And, that is, there's a part of that is a reflection of her experience with immigration detention, because she still views me as someone who is a good person, right? And the idea that I could have been in jail, and we're using the term jail, but what I was really referring to in my speech was immigration detention. And she was not born when I was incarcerated in state prison. And when she came to see me in immigration detention, that's the memories of jail that she has, right? And so having to admit that to her and seeing her look was something that she, I think, still struggles with. The idea that, here's a good person in my eyes who, in some respect, by certain parts of society, have been deemed to be a bad person. And to see her struggle with that at a very young age is, I would again argue and say that it is some remnants of her exposure to what we went through during immigration detention.
Obviously, ICE doesn't take that into consideration based on what we've seen with the separation of children from their parents near the Mexican border. Many of those parents have not been charged with anything other than trying to enter the country without having gone through the normal processes. When ICE came for you in 2014, were you still on parole or probation?
No, I had successfully completed state parole. And, I had done that a year and a half prior. So it wasn't like, 2 months afterwards. It was almost a year and a half afterwards.
And you had, as you said, were going for your master's degree in social work. Did you start thinking seriously about education while you were in prison?
Yes. The first time I sat in a college classroom or in an academic setting on a college level was in a maximum security prison. And
was it different from when you were younger and had gone to high school?
Yeah, I never really saw myself as someone who could engage in college academics successfully. I grew up in a household where, as much as my mother loved me, she pushed me to graduate high school. And once I graduated high school in June of 1999, that was it in terms of what her goals were for me. And I say that very lovingly. My mother was someone who pushed me to be everything that I am today. But in terms of academics, she saw that was something that you can strive and aim for and achieve. And once I did, it really wasn't a push. On top of the fact that, I grew up in a neighborhood and unfortunately in an educational setting where higher education really wasn't something that was materialized for me. It wasn't something as a young man who was extremely bright in terms of academics. It wasn't something that was really encouraged for me.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Southside Jamaica, Queens, and I'm a product of the New York City public.
I was born in Jamaica, Queens.
Oh, nice, yeah. So I
like to tell people I was born in Jamaica.
Well, I grew up in between Sutphin and Linden, Sutphin Boulevard and Linden Boulevard, and grew up in a neighborhood that was ravaged by the crack epidemic of the 80s. And when I grew up in that neighborhood, it was still struggling. It was still recovering from that. And so growing up in that environment, young men of color weren't always encouraged overtly to go to college, right? The mere fact that I graduated high school on time in comparison with my peers I was light years ahead in many respects in terms of educational achievement.
I'm assuming that you became interested in social work based on your personal experiences.
Yeah, I became interested in the idea of helping other people because I myself had been helped. I even very early on in my incarceration, I talk about how I was mentored and guided and in some respects saved by the older men who were serving time in the prison where I was at, who actually helped me get involved in programs, who helped me get involved in the 1 year of college that I attended while incarcerated to literally keep me out of trouble, to keep me out of the recreation yard, which unfortunately where all too often most of the trouble happens in prisons and jails. And so, it was because of that guidance and because of that help that I wanted to ultimately pay it forward. I wanted to give back to people. When I left prison, I just kept saying that I wanted a job in human services. I said I wanted a job working with people because I want to help. And so, it was because of my exposure to not only the prison system, but the humanity that I engaged with while in prison that actually showed me that you can invest in other people And the more that you invest in them is the more likely that they are to succeed.
You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large. Khalil Cumberbatch, who is Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society and an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. You were pardoned by Governor Cuomo in 2014. Now, what's the difference between being pardoned and commuted?
So, excellent question. Both a pardon and a commutation fall underneath the umbrella of clemency. And so clemency is given by the executive branch of government, in this case, the governor. And so a pardon is generally given to people who have already served a sentence, who are facing some form of collateral consequence due to that criminal conviction. And so immigration collateral consequences are part of that. And then a commutation are generally for people who are serving a sentence. And a commutation can push them closer to the door. It can push them closer to a parole board. But it does eliminate the remaining part of the sentence that a person has.
So in the case of Michael Cohen, it would be commutation. In the case of Manafort, it's a pardon.
Yes.
And we're talking a lot about pardons these days. People are a bit confused about them. But Governor Cuomo has rarely used his power to pardon. How did he even know about your case?
So I don't know exactly how the governor heard about my case. I do know that the governor at the point where I was being detained, which was in 2014, was looking more and more to use pardons in a way that would help the folks who are facing deportation. And so, prior to my being detained in immigration detention, I was home for 4.5 years, right? And so all of the people that I knew and I met and I worked with were all advocates and activists in some way. And so they just told my story multiple times over and over again, including on this radio station, including by people like David Rothenberg. And people started telling more and more people. And ultimately, that somehow got to the governor's council, a gentleman named Alfonso David, who learned of my case and met with my family and actually heard from them firsthand about what I was facing.
David Rothenberg, the founder of the Fortune Society, which is where you now work. Mm-hmm. Do you know whether ICE was aware of any of the details of your post-prison life, your family, your work or study, your application for clemency when they detained you?
Yeah, so the clemency application was put in after I was detained. And so I would dare to say no, that ICE didn't know.
Because you obviously presented no risk.
With the caveat, though, that even if they did know, ICE's job is to largely sweep people into the system, and they don't care where they get you from. And and the example of the man taking his wife to the hospital to deliver her child is a clear example of that, right? The fact that you can detain someone who is quite literally also posing no risk, delivering a pizza to an army base. This is a man who's not hiding from anything. He's just quite literally doing his job. If they can arrest and detain him, it's because they don't care about what you're contributing to society. Their goal is to sweep people into the system, and they will execute that goal as ruthless as they have to be, as deceiving as they have to be, to actually reach that quota.
Now, you mentioned that this was during the Obama administration. Had similar things happened during the George W. Bush administration, or do we have any idea why the Obama administration got so hot for deporting people? Were there criminal cases that had inspired the change in policy? Yeah, I mean, one day when I meet former President Obama, that's going to be one of my questions, and I say that not jokingly. My assumption and analysis of the situation is that President Obama coming into his office had a legacy that I think he had in mind. I think that he articulated that during the campaign, which was that he wanted comprehensive immigration reform. I think when he got into office, he realized that was what his vision was going to be unattainable unless there were certain sacrifices that were made. I think that when you talk about immigration reform, the notion of good immigrant, bad immigrant is inevitably part of that conversation. It's very easy to blame people for having criminal convictions
And it's very easy to paint the narrative that they somehow chose to do those things. And so I think the Obama administration was willing to, quite honestly, sacrifice millions of people for the hope of actually achieving comprehensive immigration reform. Once he saw that wasn't able to happen, things like Dreamers and executive orders that he put forth was a way to kind of address that. But I think what easier base to sacrifice than people who are quote unquote criminals, right? And so if you ask the DHS representatives, the Obama administration themselves about their deportation record, they'll say that, they'll say things like what ICE says. Well, the huge majority of those people were people who had criminal convictions, right? And even to the point where in 2014, this was, well into 6 years into his tenure, the president goes on national TV and says, we're going to focus on felons and not families, right? That was a clear indication that he did not plan to move away from his current policy, but also that there was no gray area involved, as if people who are convicted of felony convictions can't have families.
Well, right now, there is the added consideration of this killing in Iowa by an undocumented, should we say undocumented or illegal? What
undocumented is what I prefer, yeah.
And how that is played in the public's mind, or at least some part of the public's mind.
Yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't fall on deaf ears with your listening audience. I think, unfortunately, it falls on deaf ears with a good chunk of this country. It's a Willie Horton situation all over again, right? Use the one case to dramatically drive fear into people to think that all people are like that. And
considering the fact that there are murders by people who are born in this country, are U.S. citizens.
And then to take it even further, right? Like the mass killings in this country are largely done by white males of a certain age group. Now, are we saying to ourselves that every single white male of that age group we should somehow be terrified towards? We should somehow do background checks and make sure that they don't have access to guns?
I've never been to a hotel in Las Vegas.
So we would never ever think that, right? I mean, what's happening now in Pennsylvania with the clear cover up of thousands of young children being molested and sexually assaulted. Right? Would we say to all Catholics, don't go to church, right? Like all priests in Catholicism are somehow sexual predators? No, of course we wouldn't say that. And as a matter of fact, there are people who would staunchly defend even the people who are guilty of being sexual predators. Now, when it comes to immigration, unfortunately, there is the false notion that we're somehow talking about, one, all Mexicans, because there are people who, when they hear immigration, their knee-jerk reaction is Mexican. And two, that we're somehow dealing with all gang members or all people who are somehow evil in their intention at all times. And so this is a very unfortunate situation that happened to the family. Of course, we're not minimizing the fact that someone's life was taken. However, we can't also use that one case to paint a broad picture of what we're going to do around immigration policy for all people who are here undocumented.
How did the ICE agents treat you when they took you into detention? Were you able to see your family?
So when the ICE agents came to my home that day, and this is a common practice that ICE does, is they didn't openly identify themselves as DHS representatives. They didn't say that they were from Immigration Customs Enforcement. They had on vests, bulletproof vests and other paraphernalia that indicated that they were police. They didn't say anything about ICE. And so when I answered the door, they did what they do a lot of times, is that they said that they were there to conduct an investigation, and that that they wanted to come in and ask me a few questions. Of course, I said, why do you need to enter into the premise? Are there certain questions you could just ask me right here? And for someone who has been on parole and someone who's had police officers come to my home before while on parole to ask me questions about instances in the neighborhood I was living in that had nothing to do with, there's a level of compliance that you want to give, because you're just like, let's just get this over with, right? I'll answer your questions, you can go and I can go. And so I let them into my home. It was in our home, in our living room, that they told us who they really were and their real intention. And so, as lovely as they can treat you, even if they roll out the red carpet for you, and very jokingly I can say they did. They bought 4 vehicles for me, right? Like, even if they roll out the red carpet for you and treat you as humanely as they can and explain to you all of your rights during that process, they know very well what they're doing in the end is to remove people who, as you said, and as I know that they know, who quite honestly pose very little risk in terms of public safety, but yet they are lying to them, they're deceiving them, bringing them into a system that they know they're not going to actually be able to be released from. In my particular example, the day that they actually came to my home to arrest me, they told me, oh, well, you should walk with some money because, you'll probably be out by the end of the day. And so, you'll probably want to get something to eat. You'll probably want to take a cab and come home. And so, wanting to believe that, I did that, right? They knew very well the type of charge that I had. They had all the paperwork on me. They knew that more than likely I was going to be deemed mandatorily detainable. But they weren't telling me any of that, right? They were openly deceiving me. And as most people in that situation, you want to believe that the best case scenario is going to actually happen.
When ICE detained you, didn't your case get some attention and community support? Joanne Page, the president and CEO at the Fortune Society, called you a poster child for what really good work in reentry looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to say that I had public and community support, quite honestly, is saying very little. I mean, there are people who lived and breathed my case for 5.5 months. And the day that I was released from immigration detention was a victory for advocates in this city, including people like Joanne, including people like David, including people like Elisa Wellick from Immigration Defense Project, Tracy Gardner from Legal Action Center, all spearheaded by my wife, who, as I said, had her own perception and had her own narrative about what was happening to her and her family. But she, quite honestly, was a rock that held that all together.
A lot of the people who are trying to get into the country from Central America are escaping violence and other problems back there. Why did your mother want to leave Guyana?
My mother wanted to leave Guyana for many of the same reasons that people leave other countries. That she really wanted to expose me to better opportunities that she felt that I would not be able to have access to had we stayed in my birth country of Guyana. Did
you ever fall under the protection of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals?
No, because by the time DACA was enacted, again, because of an executive order by President Obama, I had already had my criminal conviction, which DACA, if you have a criminal conviction, makes you ineligible for. And so I didn't qualify for DACA.
Or the DREAM Act.
Well, the DREAM Act technically never passed, right? I mean, that was something that didn't happen underneath the Obama administration. The DREAM Act was the ultimate goal. DACA was a program that was initiated by executive order because the DREAM Act was not going to happen because of all of the stalling in the legislative branch at the time during Obama.
As a child growing up in New York City, what did you understand about your status in the United States? Was there always a chance that you and your mother might be deported?
No, I mean, I came here as a legal permanent resident. I came here with a green card. And so before we even got on the plane, I was a legal permanent resident here. And so, growing up in my household, I always knew what my status was. I knew that I was a green card holder. But also, I grew up in this country from the age of 4, right? I mean, I quite honestly view this as my home.
Did you ever go back to Guyana?
No, I don't have any family members there. I don't have any anyone that I would welcome me with open arms, had I been deported, or even if I get off the plane right now. And so, no, we never returned. All of my family are here, including my uncles, aunts, cousins, so on and so forth, but also my family, my wife and my children.
I'm speaking with Khalil Cumberbatch, Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society and an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work. You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. Several cities like New York have now declared themselves sanctuary cities. What does that mean in practice? Is local law enforcement helping ICE in any way now, despite the sanctuary city status?
Yeah, sanctuary cities are a very unfortunately deceiving term. I think that people hear that and assume that someone undocumented can, walk freely about the city. But the reality is that while local law enforcement won't voluntarily turn information over, if someone is arrested and they are facing certain charges, they are required to turn that information over. If a person is being held in a jail, they won't hold them on an immigration detainer, but Immigration and Customs Enforcement will be informed that this person was held in the jail. And so the previous practice was that if a person was arrested and charged and they were being released, that ICE could then say, can you hold this person for 72 hours? And in many cases, it would go beyond 72 hours. But the local jail, in this case, New York City Department of Corrections, would hold that person until ICE came to pick them up. Now, the New York City Department of Corrections will still inform ICE, but they just won't honor the detainer. ICE will still issue the detainer, but they won't honor it. And so sanctuary in the sense that, yes, there is certain non-cooperation, but there is still collaboration in many respects.
Do you find when people learn your story in different parts of the country that they have different reactions to it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think being able to talk openly about a criminal conviction in a major metropolitan city in a state like New York is very different than talking about a criminal conviction in certain parts of the South, or even in certain parts of the Midwest, or even in certain parts of this state. And so, yes, I think people have a varied amount of reactions. But one of the many things that I think all too often happens is people hear the exceptional outcomes of my story and somehow equate that to me myself being exceptional. But the reality is that I'm not exceptional, or that I am the product of very exceptional opportunities, some of which includes working at an amazing organization like the Fortune Society, teaching at Columbia University, getting a pardon from New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, and so all of those things are not because I'm the smartest. It's because I have been exposed to exceptional opportunities. I would also argue and say that if we expose more people to those same exceptional opportunities, that I wholeheartedly believe that we would have similar outcomes.
Well, this reminds me of what happened when President Trump gave a speech in which he paid tribute to Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents and Customs and Border Patrol, and he praised a Latino agent for saying that he speaks perfect English, as if that were a surprise. Do you run into attitudes like President Trump's? Yeah,
I think that when people hear my story, they see me, right? I mean, your listeners can't obviously see me, but when I have a suit and a tie on and I present a certain way, I've had people tell me like, I can't believe that you don't look like you've been to prison, right? And so
how are you supposed to look like
exactly?
You've been to prison?
And you know what? And I know the answer to that question. I think that people are expecting you to talk a certain way when you've been incarcerated. I think people are expected for you to look a certain way, and all too often that looks like a black male. And if you're not a black male who is muscle bound, who somehow can't articulate themselves, then somehow you could not have gone to prison, right? And so the example that I always give is Martha Stewart, right? No one now, even when people think of Martha Stewart, like no one really even gives much thought to the fact that she herself is formerly incarcerated, that she served time in a federal facility for something that she was convicted of, right? And so no one thinks of that when they think of prison and jail. We've been conditioned covertly in many respects to think of formerly incarcerated people who have been to prison and jail, as being of a certain class, being of a certain race, and being of a certain gender.
You use phrases like formerly incarcerated. Can something as simple as language, saying prisoner as opposed to detainee, affect the way people understand a story?
Of course. I mean, language dictates perception, and perception dictates actions, right? And so, we've learned from some of the most atrocious, horrendous policies in world history that one of the first things that you must do in order to enact, some vile acts on people or a certain subsect of society is first you must dehumanize them. And so the easiest way to dehumanize them is to refer to them everything less than a human being. And we've seen this in Nazi Germany. We've seen it all across the history of this world. And so, yes, when you refer to someone who is formerly incarcerated, someone who's currently incarcerated, no matter what their conviction was for, as anything less than a human being, then it makes it easy to do things like put them in solitary confinement for indefinite periods of time. It makes things easy like separating children from their parents, mothers and fathers, and actually having no qualms about that, and actually arguing very openly about why that's a good thing, and actually holding people up for speaking quote unquote good English, right? Like the moment that you dehumanize people, it makes the standard in which we treat them much less. And so once you lower the standard, even substandard treatment is viewed as high.
The argument has been made that if you don't want to be separated from your child, don't enter the country illegally.
Which I would argue and say that the response to that is that many of the people that are being separated from the children are actually trying to enter legally. They're actually going to the border, they're being granted entry, and then they're being separated from the children and put in immigration detention. So your listeners should be aware of that there are people being separated from their family who are trying to enter through quote-unquote legal means. But I would also argue and say that many of the countries that we're seeing an influx of people coming into the country undocumented or crossing borders without proper documentation are some of the same countries that 20, 30 years ago, we enacted foreign policy that ravished those countries, decimated them economically, completely toppled and destructured their governments. And so what we're seeing now is a reflection of that, including the three countries that make up the triangle, where we're seeing most people fleeing from because of violence that is a direct result of our foreign policy 15, 20, 30 years ago.
It's been pointed out that Stephen Miller, who, by his own uncle, in fact, that Stephen Miller, who is one of the architects of the policy, the draconian policy, would not be here if his grandparents hadn't been able to immigrate to escape death in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the hypocrisy that comes with our current immigration policies, no matter who the current administration is it cannot go unrecognized. I think the hypocrisy of the current administration is obviously in many respects higher than past administrations, but hypocrisy nonetheless.
The Fortune Society Facebook page says, quote, legality has not always been a barometer for morality. Do you think that morality demands some action now, given what the Trump administration is trying to make illegal?
I think morality and humanity. I mean, I think humanity more. I mean, despite what your morals are, you should view what's happening now to other human beings as a humanitarian crisis. I think the same way that we look at other countries and we see children starving and we see refugees fleeing violence and we see, people, bathing in water that also has sewage in it, and the same way that pulls on our heartstrings, we should also be asking ourselves, what type of legacy are we leaving our children, our children's children, who the same way that they question us about civil rights, the same way that they question us about all of the other humanitarian issues that this country has struggled with and still yet to, in many respects, solve, we too will be questioned about our immigration policies and what we did as quote-unquote good people of good morals, and around the issue around mass incarceration. We will be questioned about what we did and did not do. For me, I would love that my answer for that to be that I was one of the many people who stood up against that in my own way as best as I could and pushed back on that. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to start referring to people as human beings, people who are undocumented, people who are incarcerated, because I, again, believe that language helps to dictate perception.
That brings us to the end of our show today. My great thanks to my guest, Khalil Cumberbatch, to Hugh Sansom, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.